Hello, my name is Mayanka. I am accounts and a finance trainer from Uplatz. Today in this class we will discuss section 177 to section 179. Section 177 to section 179 of the Income Tax Act. So now we will start our discussion. Number 1. Liabilities arising when an association which is carrying on business and it is dissolved. Is that what will be the liability when there is any association and such association is carrying or engaged in the business activity and the business of such association is dissolved or discontinued in the case when there is any association and such association is carrying on any of the business activity and the business of such association is dissolved or discontinued. So what will be the liability? Section 177. Section 177. When there is any AOP and such AOP is carrying on the business activity. There is a AOP and such AOP is carrying on any business activity and the business of such AOP has been discontinued or it has been dissolved. The AO is bound to make an assessment on such AOP. Means the AO he will make an assessment of the total income of such AOP as if no such discontinuation has been taken place. Means the assessment shall be taken place or the assessment shall be made by the AO on such AOP as the discontinuation is not taken place. Means the assessment shall be made as normal. Means just like a normal case. Means it will be considered that there is no dissolution. There is no dissolution and all the provision which are relating to the income tax, all the provision which are relating to the income tax and all the provision which are relating to the penalty or any other provision which is relating to the provisions of any other sub will also be applicable on such AOP at the time of assessment. Means in the case of assessment, the provision of income tax, the provision of penalty, the provision of other dues will be applicable on such AOP. Will be applicable on such AOP is that when there is any discontinuation or there is any dissolution of any AOP, there is a discontinuation and there is a dissolution of any AOP, then the assessing officer he will make an assessment on such AOP and calculate the total income of the AOP. And and the assessment shall be made that there is no any dissolution. Means with the presumption that there is no any dissolution. Means as a normal case. And all the provision of the Income Tax Act, all the provision of penalty, all the provision of income tax, all the provision of penalty, and all the provision which are relating to the other dues or the other sum will be applicable on such AOP. All provision will be applicable on such AOP. Number two, if the assessing officer or the commissioner in the course of proceeding under this act in the respect of any AOP is satisfied that the AOP is guilty of any act attracting the provision of section 270 or 275, then he may impose or direct the imposition of the penalty in the accordance with this section. If the assessing officer or the commissioner of the commissioner appeal, he is he is in the he is means if the assessing officer or if the commissioner, if they are satisfied that the association of the person is guilty of any provision. If the AO or the commissioner appeal during the proceeding under this act and they are satisfied that such AOP is engaged or the AOP is guilty of any of the act and which is attracting the provision of section 270 or 270 to 275 means the provision of penalty. then then they will impose the amount of penalty. Then AO or the commissioner, they may impose the amount of penalty on such AOP, if they are satisfied that the provision of section 270 or the provision of 275, the provision of section 272, 275 are applicable on such organization. Number 3, every person who at the time of discontinuation or at the time of dissolution, a member of the AOP and the legal representative of any such member who is deceased shall be jointly and severally liable to make the payment of tax, to make the payment of penalty, to make the payment of any other sum which is payable under this act. Is that in the case of such AOP, the assessment shall be made by the AO, and on the basis of such assessment, the AO will calculate the amount of tax, will calculate the amount of other duties or penalty. Then each and every person who is the member of such AOP at the time of dissolution, at the time of discontinuation, the or the legal representative of the deceased member, they all are liable, they all will be liable jointly or severally to make the payment of tax, to make the payment of duties, and to make the payment of any other dues which are required to be paid under the Income Tax Act. Means if there is any penalty which is imposed by the AO, which is imposed by the commissioner, any amount of tax which is required to be payable, then all the members and the legal representative of the deceased member, they all are required, or they all are liable, or they will pay the tax, they will pay the sum or penalty to the income tax, to the under the Income Tax Act. Means they all are severally and jointly liable. Where the dissolution and the discontinue of the AOP had taken place after the commencement of any proceeding, under this act, then the proceeding may be continued. It may be continued against the member if the discontinuation, or if the dissolution of the AOP has been taken place, it has been taken place after the commencement of any proceeding, after the commencement of any proceeding under this act, then the proceeding may be discontinued. Then such proceeding may be continued on the members, on the or against the members of AOP immediately prior to the discontinuation or the dissolution, and the legal representative of the deceased member from the state at which they stood at the time of discontinuation and dissolution. The liability of the legal representative in the case of deceased member shall, however, be limited to the extent to which the state is capable to meeting the liability. Means the liability of the legal representative will be limited, and it will be limited to the extent to which the state is capable to meeting the liabilities. But if the legal representative, while his tax liability remain undischarged, create a charge on or dispose of or the part with any of the assets of the estate of such deceased, which are or may come into possession. This personal liability shall, however, be limited to the value of asset so charged, disposed, or the parted with. Is that if there is any legal representative of the deceased member, then the liability of such legal representative will be limited to the value of estate which will be capable to meeting the amount of liability. But if the amount of such estate is not sufficient, to discharge the amount of liability. To discharge the amount of liability, then such a legal representative, he will discharge the liability by disposing of the assets, by disposing of any assets or the part of the assets of such deceased person. To discharge such liability, to discharge such liability is that if the legal representative, he has any he has any assets of such deceased member, then he will sell out it. Then such legal representative sell out it, dispose it, and from such amount he will make the payment, or he will discharge the liability of such person. He will discharge the liability of such person. So, so if the amount of the liability remain undischarged, if the liability of such person, of such a legal representative is undischarged, then create a charge or dispose of any of the assets or part of the assets of the deceased person and make the payment of such a liability. The personal liability of such person shall be limited to the assets value, shall be limited to the value which is disposed of. Now we will discuss companies under the liquidation. Companies under the liquidation, the companies under the liquidation, section 178 and section 179. Companies under the liquidation, companies under the liquidation. Number one, in the case of all companies, first we will discuss the provision in the respect of all companies, section 178, in the respect of all the companies. Number one, notice to assessing officer. Number one, the notice to the assessing officer. So every person who is the liquidator of the company, every person who is the liquidator of the company means at a time of binding up, each and at a time of binding up, every person who is the liquidator of company, whether under the order of court or whether otherwise, or the person who is appointed as the receiver of the assets or of the assets of the company, then such person shall be bound under the statutory obligation, and according to such obligation, he will give a notice to the assessing officer. He will give the notice of his appointment as a liquidator or as the receiver, as the case may be, to the assessing officer. This notice may be given within the 30 days from the date of his appointment. Within the 30 days from the date of appointment is that if there is any person on the binding up of if there is any binding up of binding if there is the binding up of any company, and on the binding up of the company there is a person who is appointed as a liquidator or as a receiver of the assets of such company, then and such person may be appointed by the court, by the order of court, or by any other way, means by any other way he is appointed, then such person is bound, that he will give he will provide a notice of his appointment to the assessing officer, means he will intimate or he will give the notice of his appointment as liquidator or as the receiver, and such notice is required to be given by him. Such notice is required to be given by him within the period of 15 days. Within the period of 15 days, such notice is required to be given. Within the 30 days. Within the 30 days, such a notice is required to be given by such person, by such liquidator, or by such receiver to the assessing officer. To the assessing officer having jurisdiction to assess the income of the company. Means the such person, such a liquidator of the company, such a receiver of the company who is appointed, there such person, he will give the notice to the assessing officer within the period of 30 days, within the period of 30 days from the date of his appointment, within the period of 30 days from the date of his appointment. Number two, information of tax due by the AO. Information of the tax due by the AO. Then the assessing officer in his turn is bound, after making such an inquiry or calling for the information as may be deemed fit, means after collecting all the relevant information or after performing all the relevant inquiries, means after collecting all the relevant information which are required by the AO, or after performing all the inquiry, now the assessing officer is bound that he will notify to the liquidator. Now he will notify the liquidator, and he will notify to the liquidator within the period of 3 months from the date of receipt of the notice of his appointment. Means after performing all the relevant inquiry and after calling for the information, after calling for the relevant information, or after collecting all the relevant information as may be considered necessary or as may be deemed fit by the assessing officer, then after he will be notified, means now AO is bound that he will notify to the liquidator, and such notif and the AO will notify to the liquidator within the period of 3 months, within the period of 3 months from the date when he received the notice of the appointment from such a liquidator. And within the period of such 3 months, he will notify the amount which in his opinion would be sufficient to provide for any tax which is there or likely thereafter to become payable by the company. Means within the period of 3 years, sorry, within the period of 3 months from the date of such a notice of appointment, the AO he will notify or he will provide the information about the amount which is on which the tax is required to be payable by the company, to provide any tax which is required to be payable by such company. Means and such amount is required to be informed, notified by the AO within the period of 3 months, within the period of 3 months from the date of notice of appointment. And the AO will calculate such amount or determine such amount after or on the basis of relevant inquiry and on the basis of relevant information. Restriction on liquidator to part with assets. Restrictions on the liquidator in the respect of assets. So the liquidator of such company is debarred from parting with the assets of the company and its property in his hand until he is notified by the AO of the amount which will be sufficient to provide for any tax which is there or is likely therefore it will be payable by the company except with the prior approval of. Means the AO he will notify the amount which is required to be payable or which will be sufficient to provide for any tax, and the amount of tax which will be payable by the company, and such amount of tax will which and the amount of such tax will be payable by the company except with the prior approval of. Accept means first point, the AO he will notify or he will determine the amount of tax and he will notify such amount of tax to the liquidator, and such amount will be paid by the company, and then after the liquidator he will transfer all these assets in his hand with the prior approval. Means the AO is diverted from parting with the assets of the company and its property in his hand until the AO determine the or notify the amount. Determine and notify the amount which is required to be payable by the company, except with the prior approval of principal chief commissioner or chief commissioner, principal commissioner or the commissioner, and so being notified shall set aside an amount which is equal to the amount notified. Means the amount which is notified by the AO in the respect of such a discontinuation or the liquidation, then the amount is required to be payable by such company, and till the date of amount payable or till the date of notified or till the date of notification, the liquidator is diverted from the assets of the company and the property of the company. However, the above restriction of diverting the liquidator from parting with assets and the property shall not be applicable on is that the restriction of debarring the liquidator from the parting with assets or the property shall not be applicable means such exempt such restriction shall not be applicable on the payment of tax which is payable by the company. Such a restriction shall not be applicable on payment of tax which is required to be paid by the company. Number two, payment over the debt which is due to the government on the date of liquidation. Payments of the payments over the debts which is due to the government on the date of liquidation and meeting such costs and expenses of the binding up of the company. Meeting such costs and the expenses of the binding up of the company. SR in the opinion of the chief commissioner, in the opinion of principal commissioner, in the opinion of chief commissioner, or in the opinion of principal commissioner or the commissioner reasonable. Consequences of failure to give notice or set aside the tax due by the liquidator. What will be the consequences if the liquidator is failed to give the notice or he is failed to set aside the tax dues? So what will be the consequences is that the liquidator is required to provide the notice to the AO about his appointment or he will set aside the tax due if he fails. So what will be the consequences? So what will be the consequences is that if there is any liquidator, he fails to provide the information or he is fails to notify the assessing officer about his appointment means from the date of appointment the liquidator he will provide the notice or he will send the notice to the AO within the period of 30 days. Within the period of 30 days if he fails to provide the notice to AO or if he fails to set aside the amount which is intimated by the AO that such amount is sufficient to provide the tax liability of the company or part with assets or the property of the company in this hand in the contravention of any provision, then such a receiver shall be liable to make the payment of tax which the company would be liable to pay. Then he shall be personally liable. Then such a liquidator personally liable to make the payment of the tax which is required to be payable by company. Means now the company will not make the payment of tax. Now the liquidator personally make the payment of such tax which is required to be paid by the company if he fails to notify the assessing officer or if he fails to set aside the amount which is intimated by the AO. It will be considered as contravention of the provision. It will be considered the contravention of provisions. So in this situation, the liquidator he will be personally liable to make the payment of the tax which will be paid by the liquidator, which will be required to be paid by the company. Now the liquidator he will personally make the payment of such tax. However, if the amount of any tax payable by the company is notified by the assessing officer, if the amount of any tax payable by the company is notified by the AO, the personal liability of the liquidator under this subsection shall be to the extent of such amount. If the amount of tax payable by the company is notified by the AO, then the liquidator he will make the payment of such tax up to such particular amount, to the extent of such amount. If the amount of tax liability is determined, is notified by the AO. If there is any liquidator, he fails to comply the above requirement, then he will be punishable under section 276A. The liquidator, if he fails to comply or if he fails to notify to the AO or to set aside the tax liability, to set aside the amount which is notified or which is intimated by the AO, then he will be punishable. He will be punishable under section 276A. He shall be punishable under section 270A. Where there are more liquidator, more than one. If for the in the case when there are the more than one liquidator, their obligation and the liability under this section are jointly or separate. Means when there are more than one liquidator, then all the liquidator will be jointly and the severally liable for such a liability. For such a liability, for such obligation, they will be jointly or severally liable. Override other laws except IBC 2016. Override other laws except Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016. Except except Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Code 2016. So the provision of this section has the effect of override. Means this section contains the override fact. It contains the overriding. Anything to the contrary contained under the Companies Act or any other law for the time being in force, and it is applicable to all the companies. It is applicable on all the companies, whether it is public company or private company, except the provision of Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Means this provision has the overriding effect. Such provision has the effect of overriding anything to the contradictory which is contained under the Companies Act or under any other law for the time being in force, and it is applied to all the companies, whether it is public company or private company, except the provision of bankruptcy code, except the provision of Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Code 2016. Means such provision does not have overriding effect on the provision of Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Code 2016. Now, in the first point, we have discussed in the case of all companies. In the case of all companies means first we have discussed just like this one. In the case of all companies, section 178, companies under the liquidation. First, we have discussed in the case of all companies. Now, we will discuss in the case of private company. In the case of private company means all these provisions shall be applicable in the case of all companies. In the case of all companies. Now, we will discuss company under the liquidation in the case of private company. Number one, liability of director. Liability of director. Liability of director. So, in the case of private company, where any tax which is due, if there is any amount of tax which is due from a private company in the respect of any income of such company, and the income which is relating to the previous year or from any other company in the respect of any income of the previous year during which other company was a private company cannot recover, then every person who is the director of such company, they will be jointly and severally liable to make the payment of tax. They will be jointly and severally liable to make the payment of tax unless he proves that the non-recovery cannot be attributed to any gross negligence, misference, and breach of duty on his own part in the relation to the affairs of company. Is that when there is any amount of tax due, when there is any amount of tax due in the respect of any private company, in the respect of any private company, in the respect of any of the previous year, in the respect of any of the previous year, and such amount is not paid nor discharged by the company, then all the person who are the director of such company, then all the person who are the director of such company at the time of such relevant previous year, at a time of such a relevant previous year, then they will be, then all the directors of such company will be jointly or severally liable to make the payment of tax. Means they will be jointly or severally make the payment of tax, make the payment of tax if they prove that, such means such negligence, such a breach of duty means, if they prove that such non recovery is not made, it is not made due to his negligence, due to his breach of duties. If they prove that there is no any fault, there is no any fault of me, then he will not be liable to make the payment of tax if he prove otherwise. All the director of the company shall be jointly and severally liable. They will be jointly and severally liable to make the payment of tax and to make the payment of other dues of the company. The personal liability imposed by this section on the director of the company, of the private company, shall have the effect of overriding any provision under the Companies Act 2013 by which the liability of the director is reduced or curtailed. Thus, a personal liability can be imposed by the AO on the direction even without the adjudication by the court. Means, means in this situation, the directors of the company will be personally liable to make the payment of tax. To make the payment of tax, so the personal liability which is imposed by the section on the director of the company shall have the effect of overriding any other provision of the Companies Act. Means such provision has the overriding effect on the Companies Act 2013 by which the liability of the director is reduced and it will be cut. Thus, the personal liability can be imposed by the assessing officer on the direction even without the adjudication by the court. Means the AO, he can impose the personal liability of the director, personal liability on the directors. Meaning of tax due. What is the meaning of tax due? What is the meaning of tax due? So, for the purpose of Income Tax Act, for the purpose of this section, the tax due means the tax due include penalty, interest, or any other sum which is payable under the Income Tax Act 1961. Is it that tax due means penalty, interest, or any other sum which is payable under the Income Tax Act? Then the sum of all these dues, the sum of penalty, the sum of interest will be considered as tax due. So this is the definition of tax due. This is the definition of tax due under the Income Tax Act. So on the basis of such a discussion, we have discussed section 177 to section 179 of the Income Tax Act. These all are the important provisions which are related to the liability in the special cases. On the basis of such a discussion or on the basis of such class, we have covered the full concept of liability in special cases. We have covered all the section in our some classes, and kindly watch all the videos so that you can properly understand each and every case and the liability in each of these cases, and you can determine how we will calculate the tax and how the income will be taxable in the hands of persons. So thank you so much for watching this video. Okay, bye bye.